BMW relaunched the Mini brand late in the year 2000, with the main production years for the range of hatchbacks taking place from 2001 to 2006. Back in the early 2000s, it all felt very futuristic at the time. The new millennium was here, and yet here was a new car that looked to its past, delivering on a retro-inspired design language that caught the attention of the car-buying public. The Mini was a hit. Sales figures boomed, and it almost felt like everyone wanted one. Buyers could spec their Minis to their heart's content, with a raft of different trim levels, paint options and decals to choose from. That was then though, and this is now.
Hello, welcome back to the channel. We're back in the Mini again today, and we're going to do a review, more of an in-depth review now that we've owned the car for just over a year now. First time round did more of a sort of initial impressions video, and I'd only actually driven the car a handful of times by the time I did that video, so it's nice to get back in it having owned it for, you know, a more reasonable amount of time and got an idea, you know, of what this car has to offer and what I like and dislike about it. As mentioned in the introduction, the Mini, you know, this is the first generation of the BMW owned Minis, the new sort of era of Minis after the original. And the original was such an iconic car that I can remember when these cars first came out, I wasn't actually a fan, you know, but then that's young me, and seeing things in the context then, I thought perhaps they were a bit overtly retro styled, and you know, we all complained, lots of people complained about how big they were versus the old car, and you didn't get much more space. I remember watching reviews on TV saying this, you know, Top Gear and whatever else. And, you know, in actual fact, you know, when you look at them today, they are actually quite small. Particularly today, you park it in a car park today and you can't believe how small they are. And now they are, you know, a littler, older car. But the original car obviously was famous for its packaging and the ability to fit, you know, 4, you know, grown-ups inside a small, you know, very small space. But, you know, today, the styling as well, you know, something that I thought was overtly retro in the past, actually I think is aged really well, and it's very timeless. And I feel that these cars possibly look better today than they did when they were new, even because the design language that's used is very iconic. Simple graphical, you know, features have really paid well. The black roof with the body lines the way they are, it's got, I think Frank Stevenson, the designer, mentioned this as being a sort of like a three stacked car. You've got the roof, the window area, and then the body work. And it's just a great timeless design. They look as good today. Well, to be fair, to me, they look better today than they did when they came out. Lots of people, you know, who aren't particularly car fans see this car and couldn't guess the year other than, you know, looking on the number plate, so to speak. They wouldn't know it wasn't a modern, you know, example of the Mini. So then the thing to dive into would be the likes and dislikes, and we'll start with the dislikes before we get onto the fun stuff that we enjoy. So every car has its positives and its negatives. So for me, the thing that I'm sort of a bit least impressed with, because of the role this car fills in my life and my driving schedule, and sort of, you know, a fun car to use, you know, on occasions, I actually find the throttle response, I don't know if you say a bit of a letdown, but it's not the engine obviously being supercharged. It doesn't have sort of, you know, lag in the sense that a turbocharger has, and it kind of has that impression of being a larger capacity or more powerful version of you know, the engine that's there. But so it's not that, it's just this sort of digital cable, basically. Well, not a cable, it's this digital throttle pedal, and it's the fact that there's that sense that when you press it, sometimes but there's a tiny pause where you can just sense that it's thinking to itself, oh, how much throttle application did the driver in fact ask for? And it really isn't a major thing at all. It just feels slightly damped, is the way I can best describe it, and that's probably more of a fault of myself and the fact that my other car, you know, weekend fun thing that I jump in and out of is the 205. And that thing is razor sharp, you know, absolutely razor sharp. So anything you get in and out of next to that can feel a little bit damp, sort of thing. I remember, you know, just going off on a side note about a similar sort of experience. I remember when I drove the Mark 1 MR2 you'll see on this channel, the AW11, I purposely took the 330 we had at the time, the E91, because I want to see how a more capable drive, you know, with much more power would fare in comparison to jumping into something like that, and whether the old car would stand up or just feel, you know, not on the level. But I remember after driving the old car, after driving the MR2 and getting back into the 3 Series, I was like, oh my goodness, everything feels numb. It's not numb, it's damped. But by the time I'd sort of driven a few miles and got closer to home, I was back in love with it, sort of thing. So it's just that calibration issue in your mind. So this car, I'd like it to have a slightly more alert throttle response. If you put your foot down and it just has a little bit of pause for thought, and heeling and towing, you have to be much more purposeful with your actuations than I might have expected, sort of thing. But I say that's just a product of it being of its era, really. So the other point I can think about is as a negative is the engine note itself, and not so much the supercharger or anything. That sounds great, you can hear it whirring away. But the noise of the engine just kind of sounds a bit gruff and a bit flat to me throughout the rev range. It doesn't sort of like come alive and sing like something like, I don't know, once again the 205, or even, you know, the 6 cylinders of BMW stuff. And I know it's not that same power plant, it's a completely different thing. It's a supercharged 4-cylinder 1.6, you know, so it does what it does. But yeah. Also added to that is the fact that everything on this car is standard. So it's got a standard airbox, it's got a standard exhaust. So I'm sure there are things you could do to liven up that sound. And actually many people commented before that changing the air intake and doing things. There was a number of things that they say the first things you do to, you know, bring your car alive. But so the throttle response and the engine noise, I'd like a little bit more from. Positives though, however, there's plenty. Not least would be the chassis and the feedback and the sort of, to be honest, it's how on its nose it feels. It's very sharp, and it wants to turn in and provide you with plenty of grip. You know, a number of people I've spoken to said they are like little go-karts, and that's a product of a number of things. Obviously, the wheels being pushed right out at the edges, you know, it doesn't really have overhangs at all. So when you turn in, you know, you can feel you've got nothing, no weight over beyond the axles. So it just feels sharp, darty, and alert. I remember coming down a road and not particularly caning it, so to speak, and I turned into the corner, and the corner was way tighter than I'd expected. And you just dial in more steering and off it goes. It just turns around. And the same thing when you get to roundabouts. You know, you go around a roundabout and it's surprising how much it just wants to turn in and go. And bearing in mind, you know, this car has actually got, you know, what by modern day comparison, you know, modern day standards, actually relatively small wheels, you know, 17-inch, I think they're 205 cross section, so it's not overtired, it's not full of, and I've not got sort of, you know, R888s on or anything like that. It's yeah, it just wants to provide an awful lot of grip. So the chassis and basically the turn in the setup, the car feels so stiff. Someone wrote a comment on how stiff the actual, you know, chassis work, the bodywork of the car is. You can really get a sense for that. The whole car feels really taut, and for you know, an early 2000s car and a car that would have been developed, you know, in the 90s, it feels really tight and really direct. The other thing, the positive I would mainly mention is that I spoke about this quite a lot in my initial impressions, because it really does, you know, smack you straight away, and that is how solid the gearbox feels and how grown up the car feels for what is actually quite a, you know, small old car, really, you know, relatively speaking. So the gearbox is absolutely, it's a Getrag 6-speed, and it feels really grown up, really meaty, really positive. It's not, as I said before, it's not that sort of snick-snack that you might get from like a Mark 1 MX-5 or like a Honda or whatever else, like a Type R, what have you, but it's like an S2000, for instance, but it's so positive and so fun to use. It feels so solid. Every shift is smooth and precise and meaty. It's a lovely gearbox, and it's one of the things I, you know, particularly enjoy about this car. The supercharger is obviously also something else that's fun about the car and particularly enjoyable. But that kind of leads me on to another point which I haven't really actually explored myself, because I've kept this car standard, and that is the fact that it feels like such a good platform to work with. It feels like such a good base because there is so much grip available, and with the supercharged engine there's a wealth of options in terms of tuning options and things like that are relatively affordable. But yeah, so the wealth of tuning options, I'm sure, and in fact, you know, looking into it briefly, you could chuck sort of, you know, even just £1,000 at this, and you could bring out, you know, 200 horsepower or so, and really start to open up the package and have something to really play about and have a lot of fun with. They're great fun as standard, but the fact that they feel like such a good base, they're so stiff, they're so sharp, and also, you know, I didn't realise this before, but the John Cooper Works models, there wasn't a John Cooper Works from factory of this era, of this generation. They were all aftermarket adaptations. So you took them to the dealer, spent I think about £5,000 or whatever it was, and then they added those onto the base model Cooper S. Whereas the modern day cars, you can buy them in works trim, straight from factory sort of thing. So if you think of it in that regard, oh, look at this E39. What a legend. And it's an old boy. Oh, it's one of those cars you just want a MOT history. Anyway, I digress. Yeah, so because of that fact that the works models were an aftermarket thing essentially, when you think about it, these days you can put on, you know, your reduced pulley and increase the horsepower and still be within sort of manufacturer tolerances, as it were. So 200 or so horsepower is easily achievable and relatively affordably so. Among others, you know, there's lots of exhaust options and things like that that probably really bring this car alive. But for now, it's staying standard because, I don't know, just with it being a low mileage example, and I'm still not sure what I'm going to do in terms of jumping in and out of other cars. I don't have the luxury of affording and hanging on to things for a long period of time if I want to try other things, and I really want to try some other stuff as well. My 205's kind of got to stay with me. I can't get rid of that for obvious reasons. They're getting very hard to find. But yeah, so we'll see. Usability wise, if you want to do a bit more of a sort of a sensible, you know, consumer review, usability wise, they're fine. They have a boot. It's pretty small, but it's usable. I get children in the back of this quite comfortably. They sit in here quite happily. Actually, it's quite easy to get a car seat in and out of. Even the Isofix seats are really easy to get to. So if you have children and you're thinking of one for sort of a weekend car, it does work in that regard. You can get the whole family in here and use it as a second car, and still have something that's quite good fun to play around with. So they work on many levels. Now, the other thing is, they are, for me, at that point whereby they're still plentiful enough that you can find them, you know, cheap and serviceable for sort of really quite low prices, sort of sub £2,000 or £2,000 thereabout. You can get you a serviceable car with lower mileage, you know, more mint examples costing upwards of sort of, you know, from there up to 5. I've even seen some up at 7 or whatever if they're real low mileage minters. But the fact of the matter is that they are quite affordable, and they're at that point where I don't know how much longer that will last. And that leads me on to my next point about reliability. So over the year that we've had the car, the only major problem I've come across would be the steering, which the power steering, which had a fault. And that also leads me on to my third and final dislike that I originally had with the car, and that was I wasn't quite so happy with the steering, because I felt that it would pull and it would tramline and it would get set in its ways, and it would decide that it wanted to follow a certain, you know, route in the road or rut in the road or whatever else. And at the time I just thought, well, it's the modern steering, it's, you know, it's an electric pump with the power steering rack, and it's deciding, and with the run flat tyres perhaps and what have you, it's just kind of what they're a bit like, and I wanted something a bit more fluid and a bit more progressive. However, after a month or two, I then had the power steering completely fail on me after about half an hour's worth of driving once it got warm, and I realised that we had to change the power steering rack. So we got a new rack put in, a new pump. It's not a rack. Let me get this straight. So we got a new power steering pump put in, and it completely transformed the car. So the steering, ever since we had it, wasn't quite right, I don't think, and the pump wasn't providing all the assistance that it can do and it should be doing. So now the new pump's been fitted, the steering is lovely. It's really progressive, and it's the steering I imagined it to have from the get-go. It pulls, as I say, in a linear fashion. It provides a nice amount of feedback in a usable, enthusiastic way. So yeah, it's transformed. And so if you drive one of these and it doesn't feel that great, it probably needs a new pump. This car's got the Sport Plus suspension, and it's so agile, and you just it's really good fun. very capable. Round this sharp corner, just turn in and it just grips. It doesn't have the sense of understeer. I think the chassis is pretty neutral. I haven't taken this car on track or anything like that. It doesn't fill that role for me. But I say it's a lower mileage example. I'm trying to sort of keep it quite nice, really. But yeah, so I can't speak about it completely on the limits, but it certainly feels great fun at usable, enthusiastic road speeds, let's say. But continuing on from that point about reliability and how some parts will start to fail as these cars get older, and I think that's what's going to happen is that if you went to a dealer, for instance, and you had a pump fail, steering pump fail, and I don't know, say else, maybe it needed a clutch or whatever else, it wouldn't be too difficult to get to the point where the car would be uneconomical to repair for some of the more leggy, more tatty examples. So at the moment there's quite a few of them around, but it won't take long before they become, I say, probably uneconomical to repair, and people move on and just chuck them in a dealer for nothing, and they put it through auctions or scrap or whatever else, and very quickly I think we might see the numbers disappear from the roads. I think over the next 5 years or so we'll see that transformation where you'll go from a car that's quite readily available to quite sparse, and that happens with everything. Lots of cars, you think, oh, there's too many of them, and then all of a sudden it's like, where did they all go? You think of even like Mark 1 MX-5s, there were literally thousands of them, 205s, Renault 5s, Sierras, Cavaliers, all these things. They just get to the point where they just disappear, and I can imagine it happening over the next 5 years or so with these. Right, yeah, so maybe we'll see some of the lower mileage examples start to go up a bit, but I can foresee that happening over the next 5 years where the numbers will dwindle a bit. So yeah, overall, they're a great usable car. It works as a weekend car. You can use it for family duties and things like that. It's not spectacular on fuel, surprisingly, but I think that's just a bit of an old school supercharged forced induction engine. If you're cruising on the motorway, it's not too bad. You can see sort of 40s to the gallon, but in reality, if you're going to be using it around town and enthusiastically, they do actually like a drink. But other than that, there's not that much to report. Other than the overriding impressions are how sharp it is and how much on the nose it feels.
The R53 generation Mini Cooper S represents a wonderful point in time whereby cars were becoming modernised, but yet still offered the driver a good degree of interaction with the business of driving. They're a blast to take down a quiet back road, and yet are modern enough to use regularly today. There are plenty of options to tune and modify the cars to suit your demands, and in all likelihood, good examples are only going to become harder and more expensive to find as time goes on. If you fancy some supercharged fun, now's probably the best time to try it out. Thanks for watching. See you next time.